Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Gakuyuini Wash Process Kenya from Matteo. There's the container right there. And Matteo, based out of Gothenburg, Sweden. And this is part 9 of our 24-part KaffeBox Advent Calendar series, and our second coffee from Matteo in this Advent Calendar. This one is a little bit of a throwback for us, as the first coffee we ever had from KaffeBox was a wash-processed Kenyan from Matteo. And given that I really enjoy reviewing Kenyan coffees, I feel like this will make for an interesting review. And again, the way that this works, the notes and tasting wheel are made with a V60. This cup right here is made with a Chemex, and we opted for our standard recipe for this Advent calendar, which is a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And roast profile for this one's kind of interesting. We're probably going to go over it a lot throughout this video. It's still on the lighter side of things, but it is a little difficult to tell, and we'll get into why that was a little later. With all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. First impression, and one thing that was a huge takeaway from this coffee upon trying it was that it was a little bit more fermenty than initially expected. Now, there were some other contributions to this cup that made me kind of wonder whether or not this actually was a wash processed Kenyan coffee, as it was definitely lacking the vibrant Kenyan acidity, but rather had a lot more characteristics in line with a natural processed coffee, most distinctly a natural processed Ethiopian coffee. And that's why the roast profile on this one was a little muddied and a little tricky, because I honestly couldn't tell if this was a wash processed Kenyan coffee, as it was definitely lacking, well, two of the things that very much define Kenyan coffees, and that can be a savory aspect, most distinctly that's tomato, but in addition to that, the vibrant acidity that's very present in a lot of those coffees. Rather, at the forefront of this cup was a berry that was much more in line with a raspberry sort of strawberry, and in a slightly less kind of tart manner. So I think the notes that they had listed on here were kind of classic Kenyan notes, so the black currants, and that's not what I was getting, because that seemed to be absent from this cup, but rather more of the red berry components to it. There is a little bit of this kind of complex pineapple that's felt in the cool down and in the finish of the coffee, but for the most part, it really seems to emit a lot more of the slightly fermenty components with a slight grain-like quality to the cup. So I'm not entirely sure that this is actually a wash processed Kenyan coffee, mostly because it is just definitely lacking the Kenyan components to the cup. It's one of those things where it might have been a one-off if I was brewing it through the V60, but it just seems so interesting that it was that far removed from what I was actually expecting in the cup. And this one right here through the Chemex actually shares a lot of those same attributes, as what I'm still picking up the most is a lot more of the kind of red fruit components. So there's one of two ways to look at this. Either this is one of the least washed Kenyan-like Kenyans I've ever had, or my assessment in it is right, because this is just a little off for me. So I'm not entirely sure. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we were getting. All right, and 3 level 4, so let's go through those real quick. The finish, level 4, and it's actually slightly on the lower side of that level 4, as this cup seems to come out a little bit more even, and I'm not entirely sure which way to take that, because when it comes to natural processed Ethiopians and wash processed Kenyans, they both tend to have very long lasting finishes, but this one right here actually has a little bit more moderate of a finish, still on the lower side of the level 4, and it does have a slight bit of fermentiness to it in that finish, so that's what's really kind of tripping me up on this coffee. Sweetness, level 4. Yes, it's definitely a more sweet coffee, and typically with Kenyan coffees, I stick that around a level 3 mark unless they have some wonderful kind of cherry is typically the one I pick up the most, but like a candied component to it. This one had much more of a berry component, but rather a kind of natural like berry component to it. So the sweetness is at the level 4, but not necessarily for the reasons I might have expected. Berry fruit, level 4. I guess regardless of whether or not this actually was a natural processed Ethiopian coffee, the berry fruit was at that level 4 mark either way. So I'm happy with it there. In this case, it felt a lot more red berry as opposed to the more tart berries for me. So I left it there at that level 4 mark. Bunch of level 3s. We'll start with the body, and the body again didn't really seem to insinuate wash processed Kenyan. So this right here, while it did have a kind of medium body, a fair bit of body to it, it didn't have that kind of noted Kenyan juicy like body to it. So that right there, while it probably would have stuck at the level 3 regardless, it felt like a level 3 to me. We're going to skip over the cleanliness. and the acidity for right now. We're going to discuss the florality because it did have a slight herbal floral component, and that could be one or the other, as I definitely felt a fair bit of that in the Tatmara from Tim Wendelboe, this kind of herbal hibiscus-like attribute to the cup. That was present in this one, maybe like a tertiary factor that I felt in here because there was a slight bit of herbality and a slight bit of some red components to it, but not quite as pronounced as the other components in this coffee, which I mentioned the citrus fruit, and it's not really overly citric, but rather it has kind of some citric tastes, and as I mentioned, this kind of pineapple gummy, which was interesting, felt kind of noted as the cup had cooled down, so that's why I said there's a little bit more complexity to this cup, as I was able to get a slight bit of stone fruit attributes to it as well, a little bit more dialed down, a little bit more on the fresh side of things as well, buried underneath some kind of more prominent berry components to it. Now we'll discuss the cleanliness at the level 3. That's what I'm saying. Typically, wash-processed Kenyan coffees still score at that level 3 mark unless they are just abundantly clear and the flavor profile is extremely defined. In this case, though, the reason it's kind of toned down at the level 3 mark is because I can feel a slight bit of fermentiness to the cup and a slight bit of graininess to the cup. So that is probably the biggest giveaway and the most interesting thing about this coffee because it landed at that level 3 mark. Acidity level 3, that's the second most defining characteristic of this coffee because naturally you would assume that a wash-processed Kenyan coffee would at minimum have that level 4 acidity to the cup, but this one really didn't seem to have a lot of the brightness to it. So I'm not entirely sure what happened on those 2 marks, but yeah, even through the Chemex, through the V60, regardless, they both finished at that same mark. There's honestly not too much to differentiate the cups between those 2 brew methods, so that right again makes things tricky yet again. Anything else really worth discussing in this tasting wheel? I don't actually think so. I think for the most part, those are a lot of the things worth highlighting because I think those were the most contributing factors to my experience with this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee, I'm going to trust my own judgment and I'm going to trust myself in this one and say that, well, it's one of 2 things. Either this wasn't a wash-processed Kenyan coffee and that's the reason I'm tasting what I'm tasting, and I'm glad I decided to just kind of ignore everything I read about this coffee and go with my own experience, or this is the most natural tasting Kenyan coffee I've ever had, and like natural Ethiopian tasting Kenyan coffee I've ever had, because it's just absent of a lot of the Kenyan traits that I am used to from Kenyan coffees in general. And I don't really know how to take that because I went into this one fully expecting a very Kenyan-like cup of coffee, and that's not entirely what I got. I'm not entirely sure what to make of this coffee because if I'm looking at it from that lens, this is very interesting that a Kenyan coffee can taste this way because it doesn't taste Kenyan at all. But at the same time, if it's a natural processed Ethiopian coffee, I think it's very interesting. I think it's good because it's actually on the slightly cleaner side of natural processed coffees, but I should have no reason to necessarily believe that it is. It just kind of comes off that way. Regardless, I like it either way because it did come out a little bit more clean. It had a fair bit of sweetness, some slight florality, as well as a fair bit of fruit components to it. So I liked the coffee in general, even if this one did kind of trip me up. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, that's a really tricky suggestion because, again, it felt a little bit more in line with the Tatmara Natural from Tim Wendelboe that I've had earlier this year. That's kind of the coffee I can compare to the most and the best because they had a lot of similar traits, most distinctly, a lot more of that kind of red berry components to it at the forefront, complemented by a slight floral aspect to it as well. It wasn't quite as vibrant, wasn't quite as pronounced as that specific coffee, but it still had a lot of similar characteristics. I think for the most part, I'll leave this review at that. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, would definitely love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well, because yeah, I'm still kind of a little tripped up on it. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. But this right here has been a review of the Gakuyuini wash processed Kenya from Matteo. Thank you for watching.